She was married for 2 months. Not 2 years. Not 2 decades. 2 months. 60 days of waking up beside the man who made her feel like the world had finally arranged itself correctly. 60 days of his voice in the morning, his laugh filling the kitchen, his hand finding hers without either of them thinking about it. And then one Tuesday night, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of night you never remember, a drunk driver ran a red light. And Daniel was gone. And Faith Walker's entire world collapsed into a single phone call she never finished hearing. Hello everyone, welcome back. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. People think grief is loud. It isn't. Grief is the shoes still sitting by the front door 5 years later because moving them feels like murder. Grief is laughing at a joke at work and then hating yourself for it on the drive home. Grief is learning to perform being okay so convincingly that everyone around you starts to believe it, everyone except the person living inside the performance. That was Faith. Present everywhere. Alive nowhere. Then one afternoon, nothing special about it, nothing cinematic, a cart bumped hers in a supermarket aisle. And a man with warm, unhurried eyes looked at her and said sorry like he actually meant it. His name was Williams. And he didn't try to fix her. Didn't fill the silence with noise. He just stayed. Week after week, aisle after aisle, conversation by conversation, he stayed. And something inside Faith that had been cold and still and quietly dying began, without her permission, to move again. She laughed, a real laugh, not a performance, and it frightened her more than grief ever had. Because laughing meant feeling. And feeling meant risk. And risk meant she was no longer safely numb. He invited her to meet his family. She said yes. She stood in a warm house full of light and voices and the particular comfort of people who love each other easily, and she let herself imagine, just for a moment, that this could be hers. Then a door opened across the room. And she saw his face. And her body knew before her mind did. That jaw. That voice. She had heard it in a courtroom. She had watched him speak into a microphone and say the words guilty and I'm sorry while she sat 3 rows back and felt nothing because she had already gone hollow. He was the driver. The man who took Daniel. And he was standing in the home of the man she was falling in love with, smiling like the past had never happened. Faith didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply went still, the way a person goes still when the ground disappears beneath them and there's nothing left to reach for. Because in that one moment, every careful step she had taken back toward living, every laugh, every conversation, every quiet decision to feel again, became a question she didn't know how to hold. Love had found her. But it had brought the wound with it. And now she had to decide something no one should ever have to decide, whether the future she was just beginning to want was worth walking through the worst moment of her past to reach it. Her name was Faith Walker. And she had learned, the hard way, that grief doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens and ceremony. It moves in quietly, the way cold air slips under a door. It rearranges everything while you're sleeping and leaves you waking up in a life that used to fit and no longer does. She was 24 when she met Daniel. He wasn't extraordinary in the way the world measures extraordinary. No grand entrance. No dramatic moment. Just a humid Georgia afternoon, a friend's backyard, and a man who walked across the grass with a cup of lemonade he never drank, just to have a reason to stand next to her. He had a laugh that sounded like it had been saving itself for the right room. And the way he said her name, Faith, like it wasn't just a name but a thing he genuinely believed in. She used to fall asleep to the sound of his breathing. That specific rhythm, slow, steady, certain. She used to trace the line of his jaw in the dark just to remind herself that something this good was real and hers and permanent. She was wrong about permanent. She was wrong about a lot of things. But nothing, not the loneliness, not the silence, not the 5 hollow years she spent learning to live without him, nothing could have prepared her for what was coming next. She thought losing Daniel would be the hardest thing she'd ever survive. She was wrong. He walked up to her like he had already decided something. No hesitation. No rehearsed line. Just Daniel, cutting across a crowded backyard on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of lemonade he never intended to drink, wearing a smile that suggested he found the entire situation faintly amusing. He handed her the cup. She raised an eyebrow. He shrugged and said, "You looked like you needed something to do with your hands." She laughed before she could stop herself. That was the beginning. He was not the kind of man who overwhelmed you. He was the kind who paid attention, quietly, consistently, in ways that accumulated over time until you realized, one unremarkable morning, that someone had memorized you. Not just your face. Your habits. The way Faith chewed her bottom lip when she was thinking. The way she always read the last page of a book first because she couldn't stand the anxiety of not knowing where she was going. The way she got irrationally passionate about things that didn't matter: bad restaurant service, poorly designed parking lots, the specific injustice of cilantro appearing uninvited in food. Daniel remembered all of it. Every small, unimportant, completely human detail. He used to say, "I'm not falling in love with the version of you that's trying to impress me. I'm falling in love with the one you forget to hide." She didn't know what to do with a man like that. So she married him. He proposed on a night so quiet it felt sacred. No restaurant. No audience. Just the two of them on the back porch with the Georgia sky doing something extraordinary overhead. He didn't make a speech. He just took both her hands, looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the answer to a question he'd stopped expecting to solve, and said, "I don't want to do life without you." She said yes before he finished asking. Their wedding was small and warm and imperfect in all the right ways. Her heel caught in the aisle carpet. The officiant mispronounced Daniel's middle name twice. Someone, to this day no one claimed responsibility, played the wrong song during the reception. And Faith laughed through all of it, genuinely, completely, her hand in his, thinking, this is exactly what forever is supposed to feel like. They had 60 days. 60 mornings of his arm thrown across her waist in that half-asleep, unconscious way that meant he reached for her even when his mind wasn't directing it. 60 evenings of cooking together badly and eating it anyway. 60 nights of his voice low and close in the dark, talking about nothing: a future house, a dog they couldn't agree on a name for, a trip to Portugal they kept almost booking. She was on her phone when he left for his walk. He kissed her forehead. Said he'd be back before she missed him. She said, "I always miss you." He laughed. Said, "Good. Gives me a reason to come back." 23 minutes later, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. And the voice on the other end, steady, professional, carefully constructed to deliver unbearable things, began to speak. And the room tilted. And the phone slipped. And Faith Walker stood in the kitchen of the apartment they had only just begun to fill with a life together, and understood, in the specific, suffocating way you understand something your body grasps before your mind will, that he wasn't coming back. Forever didn't end slowly. It ended in 23 minutes. The people came first. They filled her apartment with casseroles she never ate and words she stopped hearing after the third day. Everyone meant well. Everyone said the same things: he's at peace, you'll get through this, time heals. And Faith nodded and thanked them and waited, with quiet desperation, for all of them to leave so she could sit on the kitchen floor and press her back against the cabinet and simply exist in the wreckage without having to perform survival for an audience. Grief, she discovered, has a public face and a private one. The public face nodded. Said I'm okay on a rotating schedule. Returned emails. Showed up to work. The private one lay on Daniel's side of the bed with his pillow pressed to her chest, breathing in the last traces of him, cologne and something warm underneath it, something that was just him, until even that faded. And the fading felt like losing him a second time. By the second year, the casseroles stopped. The calls thinned. People had lives that needed their attention, and grief, other people's grief, has a social expiration date no one announces out loud but everyone quietly enforces. Faith noticed the moment she stopped being someone's concern and became, instead, a situation that had been handled. She kept going to work. She kept paying her bills. She kept her hair cut and her apartment clean because chaos felt disrespectful to the life they had been building. But she stopped making plans. Stopped imagining next month, next year, next anything. The future had once been a place she and Daniel were traveling toward together. Without him it was just distance. Empty and directionless and too large to look at directly. She talked to him sometimes. Not out loud, not at first. Just internally. A running conversation she conducted in the space behind her eyes, the way you continue an argument after the other person has left the room. She told him about her day. She complained about her coworker, Marcus, who microwaved fish in the break room without remorse. She told him when it rained and she thought of him, when a song came on and she had to pull her car over, when she saw a dog on the street that looked exactly like the one they could never agree on a name for. She told him she was angry. She told him she wasn't angry. She told him both things on the same Tuesday. By the third year people stopped saying his name. She noticed that too. The careful way conversations navigated around Daniel, around the fact of him, the absence of him, as if he were a piece of furniture someone had removed from the room and politeness required pretending it had never been there. As if forgetting him faster would somehow constitute healing. Faith didn't forget. She refused to. His shoes stayed by the door. His books stayed on the shelf, spines uncracked, exactly as he'd left them. His side of the wardrobe stayed full. She wasn't delusional. She knew he wasn't coming back. But touching those things felt like the only form of loyalty still available to her, the only way to keep saying you existed, you mattered, I have not moved on, and moving on, she had decided somewhere in the long sleepless architecture of year 2, was not something she intended to do, because moving on felt like agreeing. Like signing some invisible document that said yes, this happened, and I have accepted it, and life continues. And she hadn't accepted it. She didn't know how. And she wasn't sure she wanted to. Loving again, she told herself, would be betrayal. Not because Daniel would have wanted that. She knew him well enough to know he would have hated the idea of her calcifying around his memory, would have said something infuriating and probably accurate about it. But because love, real love, had cost her everything. And the only way to guarantee you never lost everything again was to make sure you never had everything again. So she kept the world at a careful, managed distance. She became someone people described as warm but private. Lovely but guarded. Someone who gave just enough of herself to sustain connection but never enough to risk it. She built her life into something functional and contained, a controlled environment where nothing unexpected could take root. She told herself it was enough. She almost believed it. And then, on an afternoon that looked like every other afternoon, a grocery cart bumped hers in a supermarket aisle. And a man with unhurried eyes and an embarrassed smile said sorry. And something moved in Faith Walker that had not moved in 5 years. Something small. Something terrifying. Something alive. It wasn't romantic. Nothing about it suggested destiny or design. There was no slow motion, no swelling music, no convenient shaft of afternoon light falling across the cereal aisle of an unremarkable Atlanta supermarket on a Wednesday that smelled faintly of cleaning product and overripe bananas. There was just a cart. And then another cart. And the specific, graceless sound of plastic meeting plastic at a speed that was entirely avoidable by anyone paying the slightest attention. Faith had not been paying attention. She had been standing in front of a shelf of cereal boxes she had no intention of buying, holding a box of something Daniel used to eat. She hadn't even registered reaching for it, staring at the logo with the particular vacant focus of a person whose body is present and whose mind is somewhere in the past entirely. Then the collision. Sharp and sudden enough to pull her back. She looked up. He was already looking at her. Not the quick, apologetic glance of someone who had bumped into a stranger and wanted the interaction over as efficiently as possible. He was actually looking, steady, unhurried, with the particular quality of attention that most people never bother to deploy in a supermarket on a Wednesday. He was tall. Dark jacket, no tie, the kind of effortless put together that suggested money without announcing it. one hand resting loose on the handle of his cart. The other raised slightly, a gesture that was half apology, half surrender, and on his face, an expression caught somewhere between genuine embarrassment and something that looked, unmistakably, like amusement. Not at her. Not unkind. Just present. Like he found the entire collision faintly, privately funny and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. That, he said, was completely my fault. His voice was low and even. The voice of a man who spoke at the volume that required other people to lean in rather than one who filled rooms with noise to establish himself in them. Faith blinked. Recalibrated. Remembered that she was a person who existed in real time and that a response was expected. It was both of us, she said. It really wasn't. You don't have to, I was reading something on my phone. He held it up briefly, as if presenting evidence. In a supermarket. While pushing a cart. The defense rests. Something pulled at the corner of her mouth. Not a full smile. Not yet. But the precursor to one, the involuntary softening that happens before your body has cleared the expression with your mind. She looked down at the cereal box still in her hands. Set it back on the shelf. I wasn't buying that anyway, she said. I know, he said. You've been holding it for about 4 minutes. She looked up. He said it without any particular weight, not as surveillance, not as a line, just as an observation delivered plainly, the way someone states something they noticed without deciding in advance whether to share it. And that plainness, somehow, was more disarming than anything calculated could have been. Williams, he said, and extended his hand with a naturalness that made formality feel casual. She looked at his hand for 1 beat longer than was strictly normal. Then, Faith. His grip was firm and brief. But he didn't look away when it ended. And neither, she realized, did she. She would not describe it as attraction. Not then. She wasn't built for that word yet, wasn't ready to hold it, wasn't willing to assign it to something that had barely drawn its first breath. But she would describe it, later, honestly, as noticing. The awareness that someone's eyes had found her, not the careful, functional face she wore in public, not the version of herself assembled for other people's comfort, but something underneath it. Something she had stopped believing was visible. Williams looked at her the way people look at things they find genuinely interesting. And Faith Walker, who had spent 5 years making herself small and contained and safely unremarkable, felt it land somewhere she had long since stopped expecting anything to reach. For the first time in years, someone had noticed her. And for the first time in years, she had noticed being noticed. She told herself it was coincidence. Same store, same day of the week, different aisle. William standing in front of the coffee section with the focused consideration of a man taking the decision seriously. He looked up when she turned the corner, not startled, not performing surprise, just looked up, the way you look up when you sense something familiar entering the room. He smiled. Unhurried. Like he had time for it. You're not holding anything you don't intend to buy, he said. Progress. She laughed before she could organize a response. And he looked quietly pleased, not smug, not triumphant, just genuinely pleased, the way someone looks when something they hoped would happen actually does. They stood in that aisle for 11 minutes. She counted, later, reconstructing it involuntarily the way you reconstruct things that matter more than you want them to. It stopped being coincidence and became something neither of them named. He was always there on Wednesdays. She started going on Wednesdays. She did not examine that decision too carefully. What she noticed, and she noticed everything, catalogued it privately, the way you handle something fragile, was that Williams listened the way almost no one listened. Without assembling his response while she was still speaking. Without steering the conversation toward himself. Without the low-grade impatience that most people tried and failed to conceal. He simply received what she said. Held it. Responded to the thing she actually meant rather than the surface of what she'd expressed. He remembered, too. The second week, he mentioned her coworker Marcus and the fish. She had said it once, briefly, throwaway. He had kept it. Asked how the ongoing situation was developing with the seriousness of someone invested in the outcome. She told him Marcus had graduated to reheating salmon and the entire floor was in crisis. Williams shook his head slowly. Some men just want to watch the world burn, he said. And she laughed, really laughed, and the sound of it surprised her own ears. Rich and unguarded and completely unperformed. He heard it too. She saw something shift in his expression. Something quiet and careful, not possession, not hunger, just a particular quality of attention that sharpened almost imperceptibly. Like something he'd been watching for had just confirmed itself. He never touched her. Not beyond that first handshake. But his body had its own language and she was, against her own will, becoming fluent in it. The way he angled himself toward her in a crowded aisle, not blocking, never overbearing, but present. A kind of quiet physical punctuation that said, "I'm here, I know where you are, nothing is going to bump into you from that side." She noticed it the third week when a man with an overloaded cart cut between them and Williams stepped, just one step, smooth, unhurried, completely natural, to her left. Repositioning without comment. Without making it a thing. It was a thing. She noticed it the way you notice a door opening in a wall you'd stopped believing had doors. And then there was the afternoon a man in the car park held her gaze 2 beats too long as she loaded her bags. Nothing threatening, just the ordinary low-level entitlement of someone who had decided to make his interest her problem, and she heard Williams's footsteps on the tarmac behind her. Unhurried. Even. But present. The man looked over her shoulder, recalibrated something, and moved on. Williams said nothing. Didn't reference it. Just fell into step beside her as though he had simply been walking in that direction all along. She was not supposed to find that as devastating as she did. She told herself it was company. That she was simply enjoying the particular relief of someone who didn't require her to perform wellness or explain her edges or justify the shape grief had left her in. She told herself Williams was interesting the way a book is interesting. Something you engage with fully for the duration and then return to its place on the shelf. She told herself the Wednesdays meant nothing. That the 11 minutes in the coffee aisle meant nothing. That the way she sometimes caught herself midweek thinking of something she wanted to tell him, and then catching herself thinking it, meant nothing. She was thorough about her own deception. She had practice. But the body keeps its own ledger. And somewhere beneath the careful story she was telling herself, in the place where Daniel's memory lived alongside the long discipline of not wanting, something had shifted. Something small and stubborn and terrifyingly warm. She hadn't chosen it. Hadn't invited it. Had, in fact, built an entire architecture of 5 years specifically designed to prevent it. But the heart, she was learning, does not consult your history before it decides to move. She told herself it meant nothing. But her heart had already started remembering how to want. He asked her for coffee the way he did everything, without performance, without a constructed moment designed to make refusal difficult. Just a Wednesday afternoon in the bread aisle, his cart beside hers, and, "There's a place 2 blocks from here that doesn't ruin it. If you ever wanted to not shop for an hour." That was it. No pressure dressed up as casualness. No expectation leaking through the phrasing. Just an open door and enough space around it that walking through felt entirely like her own choice. She said yes. Then she went home and sat on the edge of the bed, Daniel's side, always Daniel's side, and held the yes in her hands and turned it over and looked at it from every angle like something she'd found and couldn't identify. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the shape just underneath guilt. She was ready 20 minutes early and spent those 20 minutes in her car outside the cafe with the engine off and her hands in her lap deciding whether she was a person who could do this. She almost left. Twice she almost left. Once she had her keys back in the ignition. Once she had actually started the engine. Then she thought of Daniel, not as a reason to stay, not as permission, but simply him, the specific reality of him. And she thought about how he used to look at her when she stood at the edge of something she was afraid of. That quiet, certain look. The one that never pushed. Only waited. She turned the engine off. She went inside. Williams was already there. Of course he was. Already seated, already comfortable in the particular way of a man who doesn't experience waiting as a wound to his patience. He stood when she walked in. Just stood, naturally, without ceremony, and something about that small instinctive courtesy, so unannounced and unperformed, moved through her chest like a slow exhale. They ordered. They talked. The conversation came easily in the way their conversations always came easily, not effortless exactly, but honest. The kind of exchange where neither party is managing the impression they're making because both are too genuinely interested in what the other is actually saying. At some point his hand crossed the table for the sugar. Hers was already there. The contact lasted less than a second, knuckles barely grazing, warm, accidental, unmistakable, and neither of them addressed it and both of them registered it in the quality of the silence that followed. A charged silence. The kind that holds more than what's being said. She looked at her coffee cup. He looked at her. And when she looked back up, he didn't pretend he hadn't been looking. She hadn't planned to tell him. She hadn't told anyone, not in full, not the whole shape of it, because telling required giving someone access to the part of her that still hadn't closed over. But something about the way Williams occupied space, steady, unhurried, generating no pressure, demanding nothing, made the words arrive before she'd authorized them. She told him about Daniel. All of it. The backyard barbecue. The lemonade. The proposal under a Georgia sky. The wedding where her heel caught in the carpet. The 60 days. The walk. The phone call. The hospital corridor and the words she heard through static that still, 5 years later, didn't fully feel real. She told him in the measured, careful way of someone recounting events they have organized into language specifically to survive them. And when she finished, she looked up, braced for the thing people did, the particular softening of their face that preceded the empty reassurances, and found instead that Williams was simply looking at her. Still. Quiet. Present. No performance of sympathy. No rush to fill the space with comfort that would have been, in truth, for his own comfort rather than hers. He reached across the table. Slowly. Deliberately. And placed his hand over hers, not gripping, not fixing, just resting there, warm and certain and asking for nothing. "I'm not here to replace him," he said. Quietly. Without drama. Like a man stating something he had already decided long before this moment and simply wanted her to know. "I wouldn't try. I wouldn't want to." She had expected many possible responses. She had built small, unconscious defenses against each of them. Against too much tenderness, which would have felt like pity. Against the minimizing, "You'll love again, you deserve happiness," which would have felt like erasure. Against the slightly too eager reassurance that would have revealed that this was, underneath everything, a man running a strategy. She had no defense for this. For the simplicity of it. For a man who looked at the full weight of what she carried and did not flinch, did not reframe, did not try to lift it from her, simply acknowledged it and stayed. That was the moment. Not the hand grazing hers over the sugar. Not the 11 minutes in the coffee aisle or the Wednesdays or the way his body moved instinctively to her left in a crowded car park. This moment. This quiet, undecorated sentence. "I'm not here to replace him." She had spent 5 years keeping the world at a distance that felt like safety. And in 9 words, Williams had walked through every wall she'd built, not by force, not by charm, not by anything she could have anticipated and armored herself against. Simply by being real. And that was when he became dangerous. Because he felt real. She didn't call it dating. Not at first. She called it, when she called it anything at all, spending time. A careful, non-committal phrase that kept the thing small enough to hold without trembling. They spent time at the cafe that didn't ruin coffee. They spent time walking along the river on a Saturday morning when neither of them had manufactured a reason to be there except the unspoken agreement that they wanted to be. They spent time at a bookshop on a Thursday evening where Williams pulled titles from shelves with the focused randomness of a man who reads seriously and broadly and had opinions he would share if asked and keep to himself if not. She asked. She always asked. And she noticed, filed away privately, handled with care, that he answered the way he did everything. Without performance. Without shaping himself toward what she might want to hear. She had forgotten that was possible. It came back in pieces. Not all at once, not some cinematic restoration, grief dissolving in a single golden afternoon. But in fragments. Small, unglamorous, completely real fragments. The evening he attempted to explain the plot of a film he'd seen and lost the thread so comprehensively that his summary bore no resemblance to any story that had ever existed, and Faith laughed so hard she had to set her glass down. The Sunday morning he arrived at her door, they had graduated, quietly, to arriving at doors, with 2 coffees and the entirely incorrect order because he admitted without apparent shame, been thinking about something else entirely and autopilot. The afternoon they got lost driving to a restaurant he claimed to know well and ended up eating gas station sandwiches in a car park, talking for 3 hours, and agreeing it had been the best meal of the month. She laughed in all of these moments. Real laughter. The unguarded, unperformed kind. The kind that had gone missing for 5 years and returned now in the specific company of this specific man, not because he was funny in a constructed way but because he was present in a way that made her present too. And presence, after years of existing slightly outside her own life, felt like joy. He touched her the way punctuation works. Not the substance of the sentence but the thing that gives it shape. A hand at the small of her back, brief and light, steering her through a crowded doorway ahead of him. Fingers brushing hers when they reached for the same page of a menu. His shoulders solid against hers when they sat side by side watching the river move on a gray afternoon and the cold came in off the water and he simply shifted. Closed the space without commentary. Without making it a declaration. These were not grand gestures. They were not designed to be noticed. That was precisely why she noticed every single one. And the way he looked at her. That was its own language entirely. Not the look of a man cataloging what he saw, not assessment, not appetite, but the look of a man genuinely interested in what she was about to say next. Who found the person in front of him interesting in the full and particular sense. Who looked at Faith Walker and saw Faith Walker, not the widow, not the project, not the woman requiring careful handling, just her. Specific, complete, worthy of actual attention. She had not been looked at like that since Daniel. She had not let herself be. There was an evening, a work event of Williams's she had agreed to attend with the low-grade terror of someone re-entering a world that expected social fluency she had spent 5 years quietly losing, where a man in a very expensive suit made a joke at her expense. Light enough to deny, pointed enough to land. The kind of socialized cruelty that moves through rooms like smoke, everyone registers it, no one names it. Williams registered it. She saw it happen in real time, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, the way his jaw set just slightly, the way his attention which had been half on the conversation across the room came back fully and settled. He didn't make a scene. Didn't posture. Didn't do anything that would have made Faith the subject of more attention in a room already making her uncomfortable. He simply moved the conversation. With such quiet authority and complete social ease that the man in the expensive suit found himself engaged elsewhere without entirely understanding how he'd got there. Williams handed her a glass of water afterward. Said nothing about what he'd done. Asked if she wanted to leave. She did. They left. In the car she looked at him and he looked at the road and she thought, with a clarity that arrived without warning and settled without permission, I am safe with this man. The thought terrified her. She held it anyway. It happened the way real things happen. Not in a moment. Not in a gesture or a conversation or a single evening she could point to afterward and say, there, that was it. It accumulated. The way water shapes stone, not by force, not by drama, but by the patient, consistent, unremarkable fact of returning. He returned. Every Wednesday and then beyond Wednesdays. He returned with the wrong coffee order and the right attention. With silence that felt like company and company that felt like rest. With a steadiness that never wavered and never announced itself because it didn't need to, it was simply, reliably, always there. And Faith, who had sealed herself carefully against exactly this, who had constructed 5 years of controlled distance and called it survival, felt the architecture of her own defenses, brick by careful brick, beginning to give. She didn't name it yet. Naming it made it real, and real things could be lost, and she was not ready, might never be ready, to hold something real again and risk the losing of it. But the body keeps its own ledger. And hers had already written something down. She didn't realize it yet. But she was falling. He said it on a Sunday. They were in her kitchen, a threshold Williams had crossed gradually, the way he crossed all thresholds, without announcement, without making the crossing a moment that required her to respond to it. He was making tea he had not been invited to make because he had, at some point in the preceding weeks, learned where she kept everything and moved through her space with the quiet ease of someone her home had simply decided to accept. She was sitting on the counter watching him. Something she had started doing without noticing she'd started, just watching him exist in ordinary moments, the specific way he held things, the unhurried economy of his movements, the way he was never performing even the smallest action for an audience. "Come meet my family," he said. "What happens next? Stay tuned."